This episode is proudly supported by Anchor Food Professionals, makers of mainland cheese. Here's Andy Sy from the Notting Hill Hotel.
We've been using them for a few years now, using their tasty and mozzarella cheese. We go through about 135 kilos a week at the moment. So a huge number. So we use it for our garlic bread, our pizzas, our parmas, our bechamel, our cheese sauce for our croquettes and arancini, throughout our lasagnas, anywhere we can really. It's such a good product. You know, having the freshest chips to your fresh chicken to a freshly crumbed schnitzel and topping up with a really high quality cheese is amazing.
For more information, go to anchorfoodprofessionals.com.
You can tailor your challenge in baking according to your level and your needs. You know, there's such a huge range of difficulty or ease, and you can set that depending on what you choose to bake.
Hey everybody, it is Dani Valent here with you, and we are doing dirty linen. We are getting the cloth filthy. Thank you so much for joining me on my food podcast. I love chatting to people in all corners of the world about their food passions, their culinary journeys, and learning more about what brings us together around delicious things and laden tables. Today's guest is Helen Goh. Helen is coming to us today all the way from London, where she lives. Helen was born in Malaysia but grew up in Australia from the age of 11. And after she moved to London, she started working with Yotta Motalangi in the Ottolenghi Test Kitchen. Her third and very beautiful book, Baking and the Meaning of Life, is newly released, and I highly recommend it for the Christmas stocking, the random gift. It is a very beautiful book. Helen, it is wonderful to welcome you to Dirty Linen.
So great to be speaking to you. Thank you so much, Dani.
Helen, you have brought your two careers together in your third book. You are a psychologist as well as a baker and author. Tell us why you wanted to bring these two fields together.
So over the years when after Sweet came out, and when Yotam and I were on tour, and, you know, he'd be telling everyone that I'm a psychologist, and I, in the past, kept that very, very separate, you know, that psychology and baking, I've done them both for decades now, and they've both been kind of two parallel train tracks, you know, that we're never going to meet. And partly that's because for me, they spoke to separate sort of parts of me, but also because I was very worried that my patients would know that that I was a cook, that it might mean that I wasn't, you know, either very professional with them, or that I didn't, you know, I wasn't sort of, you know, focused very much on their care. So I'd kept them very separate. But after that sort of came out when we were on tour for Sweet, I did have a number of publishers contact me about the possibility of doing something that combines the two. And I think what is popular is the notion of baking as therapy. And I think that's where they were coming from. And I get that. Like I do know, and for myself, and I do know lots of people talk about baking, you know, being therapeutic. But I thought, what else can you say about it, you know, apart from the fact that it is therapeutic? And I guess it was a confluence of two things. One, I did my doctoral thesis on the lived experience of women without children. So it was a qualitative piece, and it was about sort of exploring how people make meaning, you know, in life. The degree that I did was ratified by a college which was helmed by an existential psychologist. So it was very much, you know, not so much about unconscious processes, but actually about conscious processes, like how do we make meaning in life? So I did that as the thesis, and that kind of oriented me towards this idea of how do we, you know, find and make meaning. And then the other thing was something that occurred in 2023. There was a spate of natural disasters around the world, and the deadliest one was in Turkey and Syria. And there was a British-Turkish cook here in England who decided to, you know, galvanize the community to do a bake sale to raise money for the British Red Cross to send over to Turkey and Syria. And the brief was, it was all done on the Bush Telegraph, which is Instagram, of course. And we had 2 days and 2 nights to kind of pull it together. And we were to deliver all our baked goods to this pub in North London at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning. So my children and I were baking, and the morning came, and my husband David sat in the car. He was driving us to this pub in North London. We live in West London, so it was quite a way away. And we were, carrying our boxes of cornbread and cupcakes and cheese scones. And we got there and we dropped them off. And as we arrived, we were all given a little empty box each to buy the goods as a kind of circular economy to, raise more money. And my husband was waiting in the car. And when we got back in the car, he said, gosh, that is just the most inefficient way to raise money, because here we all were, so many cooking all day and night and, charging £2 for a cupcake. And I thought, you know what, you're absolutely right, because it would have been much easier just to donate, £10 each. But I think what my husband didn't see on that morning is that energy in the room, this idea that these bakers were doing something that they were competent in an act that went beyond just our selfish own interests, to raise money in solidarity for these people, these people thousands of miles away. And it just spoke to the power of baking as the kind of what it symbolizes. And it has always done that. I mean, we've always celebrated food with food, but we mark important moments with cake and bakes. And I think it's because of the very idea that they're not necessary. They're not essential for survival. So we make them, we bake these cakes and things as a way to represent something else other than, nutrition, because it's not nutritious, not often. So all the way back in the car from North London back to West London, we were kind of talking about this and arguing a little bit about it. And I think David got put very much in his place that morning. And it gave me the idea, the seed of the importance, and not just, we're making it not just for the comfort and the joy that the little bake delivers, but just something else that we're trying to say with it.
So you do have this theoretical framework for the book, which I love. You really do find those connections between psychology or existential psychology and baking, and around these pillars of coherence, purpose, and significance. And the chapters of the book reflect some of that mosaic of experience with themes such as autonomy, competence, relatedness, beneficence, creativity, which I love, that sort of codifying of it and the sort of drawing out of these threads. If I think about myself baking, and I'm not a precise cook, so I don't lean towards baking. I am just what's in the fridge or what looks good at the market and just throw it all together, though I definitely appreciate a good bake. But I think what I love about this is the sort of orderliness, but also the expansiveness. There is so much space to be human in these pillars and themes that you find in baking.
I think the title is so grandiose. It's, the meaning of life, like a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or something. But that's why I codified it, because I think that, it's less lyrical in a way, to codify it like that. But I just felt that even though, obviously it's not so serious, with the meaning of life. I don't have the answer to the meaning of life. But I think because I try to say something about baking, adding to the meaning of life, I felt I needed to justify it in some way. And I prefer your word, actually. I think codifying it is much nicer, because in my head it was like, I have to justify it in some way. But I love codifying, so I'm going to use that from now on.
Yes, you are welcome to use it. I thought it was really interesting, Helen. You know, you spoke about these two tracks of your life. You know, psychology is there, staying in its lane, and baking is over here. When you found these themes and drew them together in one book and codified, did you find it a stretch, or did you feel this sort of clicking into place? Like, had it always been within yourself separate, or did you always see resonances?
That's such a good question, because I've been thinking about this. I think initially it went in waves. After that sort of drive back in the car, I thought, oh gosh, no, this is it. You know, I've got an idea here. And then when I started to work on it, I thought, shit, this is really drawing a very long bow. And then actually when the recipes, I did it kind of ground up. I really did mine my life for these recipes, these experiences that I've had, because I've been cooking for quite a long time. And when I reflected on the context of the baking, there was a context. You know, there was almost always a reason, because yes, I mean, even if it was that I was just trying to perfect something, that still spoke to something about me that wanted to do that, which was about this idea of creativity, learning, growth and achievement, which is one of the chapters. So even when I thought it wasn't a relational context, it still felt like there was something meaningful in it for me. So as I began to think just, one by one and reflected on that experience, it came up quite organically. So, and then, this idea of collating those seven, grouping them into these seven chapters, then that again felt like, oh gosh, I had to sort of move things around a bit. But in a way, that was part of the experience with my doctoral thesis, which was I had to, after interviewing, a group of women, I then had to code them into similar headings and similar chapters of broad themes, basically. So it wasn't different to that. And I kept reminding myself that in the same way that I did that thesis and it came together, this will come together as well. And once that happened, once I got the 7 chapters, the difficult thing was actually that the same recipe could belong in multiple categories. So it could be something that I did with my son, Jude, because we were kind of in the way of nurturing. He was sort of working with me and baking alongside me and being curious and watching his sort of sense of mastery. We would then take that to a picnic where we would share with people. So there was a sense of community, or a bake sale at the school. So then actually the difficult part was actually in trying to tease out what belonged where. And really, it's an arbitrary grouping for me, because the same thing, the same recipe for you might fit into a different category,
Yes. Well, I suppose meaning is communicable, or you can translate it and perhaps transfer it, but it is very personal as well. And even the same cake might mean something different in the giving and the receiving.
Absolutely, yes.
And different in time as well. Like, I suppose a cake is a spectacular birthday cake that you have as a child, or for your 21st or your wedding, I don't know, that you then have decades later, then it's got all that nostalgia. It carries such different weight and stories.
Exactly. And when in the broad brushstrokes of it, I thought of baking as what the reason it was important was that it touches both the personal, the relational, and the cultural. And once I got that 3 big brushstrokes, it was easy to tap into how it was personal for me, how it was relational, in what context did I share these cakes, in what context did I create them, and then this idea of cultural, the rituals and the traditions that really ground us, so whether it's a pineapple tart for Chinese New Year or a mince pie for Christmas, there are so many rituals and traditions that baking is uniquely there to mark. And and in fact, I think you could just do a whole book on the rituals and traditions, of baking around the world, the significance of it. And I think what's really important about that is that it helps us locate ourselves in time and in community, because you know that at Christmas time, obviously not everybody celebrates Christmas, but thousands and millions of people do. And around December, these people are all eating and making mince pies around the world. So there's something that locates you in time, in place, and in community. And, just that alone opens up so much in terms of, baking in these traditions that we have.
Well, I think it can also be a way of finding your place in a tradition that you don't belong to or haven't belonged to forever. And, I noticed there's so many savoury recipes in this book, and one that really stood out for me was the challah. So a plattered Jewish bread that's often eaten on, for the Friday night Sabbath. I'd love you to tell me about that recipe's place in your life.
So we do a Shabbat. Well, we try to do a Shabbat. My husband's Jewish, and it's something that we try to do it every Friday. And the challah is very important to him. I didn't grow up with it, but I know how important it is for him. And we're not terribly religious, but it symbolizes something: the unity, the bringing of the. I guess he's always had it with his family, and it was a way of honoring the continuity. So that could have gone in the chapter called continuity. But for me, it was a ritual and a tradition that we do, every Friday night. And that's an interesting recipe because I used to buy a challah and we all love it, but it's so rich and usually so rich and sweet. And it just always felt, because I didn't grow up with it, it always felt to me to be an appetite spoiler rather than an appetite whetter. So and I guess my husband didn't have that sort of that feeling about it, because for him it was more symbolic than it was the taste, but I was more oriented towards the taste. So for the book, I really wanted one that was not so rich and not so sweet, that we could eat with dips, for example, and olives, to start the meal. And when I worked on that recipe, I was helped by actually Jake Norman, who worked at the time at the Ottolenghi Test Kitchen, and it didn't have eggs in it, which I think is quite unusual, and it didn't have it has a tiny bit of honey, but very little. And I thought, what, I much prefer this. And it's almost vegan, actually. In fact, apart from the egg glazing on top, it is vegan. And I did try very hard to make it a complete vegan recipe, but that glaze, for me, it's just that the plattered glazed loaf on the table is so beautiful. I had to have the egg wash.
Helen, I'm going to ask you to talk about another recipe that I'm sure will throw you back into this particular period of your life. It is the Donovan's Bomb Alaska. Donovan's is a restaurant in St Kilda in Melbourne. I was just at the Good Food Guide Awards recently, and it retained its hat. So it's certainly a beloved restaurant that's recently gone through a big change of ownership. It's been handed over by the Donovans to Nick Parkhouse, the next custodian of this amazing restaurant. Tell us about your connection to Donovans, Helen, and about where you were in your life when you went to work there.
It was it's a long, circuitous story, but when I had my cafe in Auburn Road in Hawthorne, it was very close to Stephanie's restaurant, which was still, open at that time. And some of the chefs used to come to get their brunch or get their coffee and their lunch before their shift. And included in the people who came was Dure Dara, who was a part owner of Stephanie's at the time. And she came very often and was kind of, I guess, watching me, either lose the plot in the kitchen or, thriving and feeling this sort of exuberance with the cafe. And my boyfriend and I did the cafe with no experience, so we burnt out very, very quickly. And I guess Dure was watching from the sidelines and could see that I was, sort of burning out. And she'd kind of sidled up to me and said, look, I've got so many plans for you. Stick around. I've got so many projects I'd love for you to be involved in. And so I did get involved in a number of her projects, including, do you remember the Noodle Bar in Burke Street? Yes, so she was opening that, and I got involved in developing recipes there. And there came a point when I said, I went into cooking and baking with actually zero experience. I learned on the hoof, and I learned from the clever people who I employed. But I always had this chip on my shoulder that I wasn't properly trained, and that I didn't kind of do the hard yards, from the bottom up. So I said this to her, and I said, I really would love to go into a formal kitchen and to learn, how to cook properly. And she said, well, she just was getting involved in Donovan's. At the time, it was Jean-Jacques by the Sea. And that why don't I, go there? So I was thrilled with that. And I joined the brigade. It was quite intimidating. There were, I think, 15 chefs, and it was quite classic sort of brigade kitchen. And I started out in the cold larder, washing salad leaves and learning to shuck oysters properly. And I was so happy because, it was just this opportunity to learn, from the ground up. But very early, I think in the very first week, might have even been the second day or third day, the pastry chef had done a runner. So I was quickly shoved into the pastry section, and it was kind of sink or swim. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I, was there for sort of 7 years from that point. I never left the pastry section, and I guess the Bomb Alaska was sort of, part of the signature, there. And that I wanted to include that recipe in the chapter called Learning, Growth and Achievement, because even though I made it every single day, it still felt like a challenge to get it right every day, to get that sponge cake right, to get that ice cream, perfectly creamy, and to get that meringue glossy and peaky and pointy. So for me, I don't think I ever just sort of did it unconsciously, just because I'd done it for so many times, so many years. It always still felt like a challenge. And so that represented something about this, what it spoke to me personally. But in the book, it's a very, very different recipe. It's been completely simplified because I remember actually Kevin Donovan was in London, Kevin and Gail, and I met with them for dinner, and we were kind of reminiscing. And I said, over the years, I've had so many people ask about that recipe. And he says, oh, Helen, you can publish that because no one will ever make it. It is so complicated and with so many different steps. So for the book, I set myself the challenge to what I wanted to convey. It was really an homage to Donovan's and what it did for me personally and professionally. But also I wanted to bring it to a home kitchen. How can we do this that uses the idea of that? Bomb Alaska, I know, is not unique to a restaurant. It's a very classic and even a kind of retro dessert. So I wanted to. For me, it was about the story of Donovan's, and then the recipe needed to be accessible in a home kitchen. So what I've got is a no-churn ice cream, and it's a chocolate base that comes together in one bowl. So it's a far cry from that recipe, but it delivers something of that nostalgia and that celebratory feel that we know and love about a Bomb Alaska.
Great story. I remember interviewing you years ago and we spoke about your first cafe and you just sort of leapt into it with a small windfall and, yeah, as you say, burnt out very quickly. But the thing that I remember from that chat, and I think I'm right in remembering it, you saying like you had this chocolate cake that you kept baking. It became very popular and you set the alarm. You'd be waking up every 1.5 hours to like turn the cakes in and out of the oven. I just like, no wonder you burnt out.
Yes, exactly. Well, we had this tiny little cafe that was busy enough because we were so determined, and it was small. We had a very small menu. We could just kind of focus on sort of doing that really, really well. And what we didn't anticipate was this, well, I guess in today's parlance, it would be, something going viral. But at the time, it was on the front page of the Sunday Age, and it had "World's Best Chocolate Cake" with my tiny face on the front page there. So it did go viral for those times, and I don't think we slept properly from then.
I love it. Your recipes are they dip in and out of so many different cultures, partly because of your own experience, but also your own interests. What do you sort of notice about the connections or the differences in the ways that baking traditions operate in different cultures?
Oh, good question. I think I'm more attuned to the similarities, actually. This idea of, in fact, one of the recipes is a pineapple mamul. So I've kind of used this idea of the jam in the pineapple tarts and during Chinese New Year. Do you know that tart?
Delicious.
Yes. So the center, it's a jam that's cooked down until it's almost caramelized and chewy. And that's the sort of point of difference. But for people who are not familiar with the Chinese New Year cookies, it's very short and buttery. And usually I love it because you just pop the whole thing in your mouth and it's just this sort of mix of textures and flavors. But I wanted to kind of bring it to a pastry that is more traditional. And even though mamul is not kind of traditional Western pastry, something about its texture, for me, it's just sort of more amenable than that very short pastry for the traditional Chinese New Year pastry. So bringing the two together, I think when that recipe came together, I thought, oh gosh, I felt like I grew a foot taller in the sense that I was bringing together my knowledge of two very separate baking traditions and kind of making something my own. And of course, there's always that concern that you're going to be charged with cultural appropriation. But for me, and I guess also working at Ottolenghi, we've always been led by this idea of cultural appreciation rather than appropriation. So I wanted to stand by that as long as you acknowledge, and I do say, the semolina pastry comes from the mamul and the pineapple comes from the pineapple tarts for Chinese New Year, and then to bring it together to kind of create something that makes it, for me, my own, which speaks to my experience as a baker.
I want to ask you about another recipe that really stood out for me because I'd never seen it before. It is Dutch baby pancakes.
Ah, right. That's one of the recipes I would cook most often. Actually, I first came across it in a cafe in Melbourne. I don't even remember the name of the cafe. So this is many, many, many years ago. And it was called pancake. So I ordered pancake. And then this thing came and I was furious. I thought, how is that a pancake? And then when I ate it, I thought, oh my gosh, this is absolutely delicious. It was kind of crispy on the outside and kind of custardy in the middle. And it was kind of like a shallow bowl shape. And I didn't put two and two together. I didn't even ask about it. I just thought, oh, this is delicious. This is, just a different way of calling it a pancake. And then how did it happen? How did I come to know about it? I don't even remember. But the reason I bake it often is because my kids love having sleepovers. At any weekend, there are always a number of kids crawling around in the house. And one of the things I often make crepes and pancakes, and there's always a kind of flurry of who's getting the first one and then making it fast enough that they can all eat together because, you're making it one at a time. So essentially it's like a Yorkshire pudding. The batter is, almost identical to a Yorkshire pudding. But what I'm doing is putting a really large skillet in the oven. So it's got to be oven proof to heat up. And I do that even before I start making the batter, which takes literally less than 5 minutes. And then you butter the pan and pour it straight into the hot skillet. And the whole thing just puffs up into this giant Yorkshire pudding. And it comes out in this sort of ready-made bowl for you to fill. And what I love about it is that you put it to the table and not only do they share, they're encouraged to tear and share. So it's just really convivial and so different to this idea of making one crepe or one pancake at a time and everyone fighting, who's getting the next piece. This one, they're completely encouraged just to tear it apart and to eat it immediately, because it's sort of this crispy edge, custardy bottom. Sometimes if I'm feeling very generous, I'll make them a chocolate sauce to dip in, like to tear and dip into this. And mostly I do sort of berries on the side and a bit of yogurt as well. And what I realized how much I love it is like all the different ways I could make it. So I had this idea of the savory version with mortadella and cheese and rocket leaves. And I think I loved that even more. And weirdly enough, when I did that for the photo shoot, usually it like a Yorkshire pudding, it sort of collapses. It can kind of shrivel and collapse quite quickly. And sometimes it doesn't. So it's just this sort of very helpful bowl shape that you can fill with, either berries, as I do in the book, or mortadella and cheese. That's a really good first bake for people as well.
Well, I'm thinking maybe that's why it appealed to me, because it looks so simple, and like even if it goes wrong, it's going to be delicious because it's got this sort of floppy, messy joy to it, and especially the flexibility of being able to do it sweet or savoury. So definitely a book that opens up the whole concept of baking, a recipe that opens up the whole concept of baking.
Yes, and I would make that most often because it's what the kids love, and it's also, I love it because it's easy.
Perfect. Helen, back to the idea of, combining your two professions. How have you come away thinking about both baking and psychology? Do you have a greater appreciation for how they can sort of percolate? Does one help the other? Are you happy for your patients now to know that you are also a baker?
Yes, I've come out. And I think a couple of them have told me that they've bought the book, which I still cringe. I still cringe about the fact that they know now, because the book is quite personal. There are many personal stories. So, it's a sort of pendulum swinging from me being this, well, especially in the early days, I was this sort of cliche therapist who never talked about myself, it's all about the patient. And now here's this book full of, a lot of anecdotes and some even not very flattering things about me. I don't sort of see the connection in terms of, I don't see the connection so clearly, but the appreciation definitely is there that my psychological insights has helped me tuned in to the emotional dimensions of baking. And to write the book, I think I couldn't have written it without that insight. And conversely, this idea of the actual practical baking has given me a lived experience of that practice in motion. And I was thinking the other day that, this sounds like I've made it up because it's the alliteration of the 3 Ps, but in terms of the patience that's required, and the being present, that focus that you need to be to bake, and trusting the process, so process, patience, presence. I think both psychology and baking have that in as part of the practice of it. Because, you know, we were talking before about baking as therapy, and I think it's because it's effortful enough for you to need to focus so that you're kind of getting away from that rumination in your head, but it's not so stressful that, you know, it creates a problem. So it's just sort of in that sweet spot that helps you to focus entirely on something that's not stressful and that's low stakes. You know, it doesn't matter if this cake doesn't work. You know, it is a low stakes situation to get you focused on something, to get you involved in something. And you know, it doesn't matter if it doesn't work out. On the other hand, it also gives you this opportunity to set yourself the challenges, because you can, each point, do something. You can tailor your challenge in baking according to your level and your needs. You know, there's such a huge range of difficulty or ease, and you can set that depending on what you choose to bake. So it's this sort of agency. It's this context of being able to give you agency and calm at the same time. Even though lots of people tell me, "Oh, baking is so stressful," but you know, I always say, if you can read, you can bake.
Well, I do believe that is the case with your recipes, because they are so well tested and so well written, so methodical and so generous in that sharing of knowledge, that I reckon that's true of your recipes. Not of all recipes, but I would say it is true of yours. Helen, it is always so wonderful to talk to you. I love your approach, and especially the depth that you've, the extra dimensions that you've given us in this particular book. It is really wonderful, and I reckon you could not go wrong buying it for yourself or giving it for a gift. And, you know, beneficence, that generosity, it's part of, it's a gift that you're giving, and then people can give as they bake. So yes, it's a very beautiful thing. Thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thanks, Dani.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This